Sorry for keeping you waiting. We're competing against a couple other events going on right now, one of which is the FTC micro conference, and the fact that the protocols might require a little bit of extra effort. Let me introduce myself. My name's Jeff Macker. In addition to being one of the best dressed here today, I'm also a professor of strategy, economics, and public policy at Georgetown's McDonough School of Business, and I'm the director of the Center for Business and Public Policy, along with John. I'd like to welcome you to this Georgetown on the Hill event, one of our first in person. We were virtual for a long time via COVID, but now it's great to be back. The Center for Business and Public Policy examines issues at the nexus of business and public policy. Think of a policy issue that affects firms or firms' attempts to shape policy into their best interests. The thread that binds us is the evolution of innovation, regulation, and competition. And certainly the event that we're holding today is directly focused on that, thinking about rethinking the role of efficiencies in merger analysis, a very timely and a very important topic. It's my pleasure to introduce Mark Whitener. Mark is a senior policy fellow at the Center for Business and Public Policy. In addition, he's an adjunct professor, having just stepped down from the department head role. Mark was very kind to teach several courses for us, and I continue to appreciate his efforts. Mark spent 35 years in industry and in government. Prior to joining Georgetown, he was the Global Executive Counsel for Competition Law and Policy with General Electric. He did a lot of merger reviews, litigations, and investigations. If you know anything about GE over the past 35 years, they did a lot of mergers. And issues are along the lines of efficiencies, I think, is something that Mark can really speak toward. Prior to GE, he was deputy director of the Competition Bureau at the FTC, where they obviously did a lot of antitrust enforcement and policy. He's got an undergraduate degree at WashU in political science, and he did his law degree at the University of Chicago. With that, I'll let Mark take over and introduce the panel. One thing I do want to say is if you have questions, which we'll eventually get to, please wait for a microphone so we can capture you on the recording. Okay, thanks a lot.
Great. Okay, thanks, Jeff. Good morning, everyone. So our topic today is thinking about rethinking efficiencies in merger analysis. As will become clear, I think, this morning, a lot of rethinking has been going on already. So we'll try to catch you up on that a little bit. Some of you may have been following it quite closely. Where to start in talking about the E word? Efficiency is a lot of things to a lot of people. The foundation of modern economics. It can be a driver of a lot of business behavior. It became the touchstone for the Chicago School's economics-based way of thinking about antitrust. But then as that approach came under challenge, efficiency at times is used almost as an epithet. So when we move from thinking about efficiency as a broad economic concept to efficiencies as factors in the analysis of a particular merger, then things become really complicated. What even counts as an efficiency for purposes of US merger analysis? What kinds of evidence is needed to prove them? And how, if at all, do efficiencies matter in the ultimate antitrust outcome? The answers to these questions can differ and at times conflict depending on the perspective from which they're addressed. The case law, economics, existing government policy guidance, enforcement practice, and or the various antitrust reform initiatives and narratives that we're hearing today, including those coming from the current leadership at the antitrust agencies. Should merger efficiencies be an integral element of the competitive effects analysis? Should they be an affirmative defense that very seldom succeeds? Should some things styled by economists as efficiencies, cost savings in the form of reduced labor, for example, be viewed not as beneficial efficiencies at all, but as harms? And ultimately, does merger analysis somehow reduce to a trade-off between competition and efficiency, or can we have both? So we have a great panel today who will begin to answer those questions. I'll introduce them briefly now, and then we will begin our discussion. And as Jeff said, we will save time at the end for your questions. So I'll just move from my left down the table. Maureen Ohlhausen chairs Baker & Bott's Global Antitrust and Competition Practice. Maureen most recently led the FTC as acting chairman and as commissioner where she directed the FTC's antitrust work, including merger review, conduct enforcement. And she also steered the FTC's consumer protection enforcement with a particular emphasis on privacy and technology. She is, and I only recently learned this, the only FTC commissioner to have received the Robert Petoskey Lifetime Achievement Award in recognition of her knowledge of and contributions to the commission. They give a lot of awards at the FTC, but that's an important one. And Maureen is a frequent writer and speaker on antitrust policy. To Maureen's left is Danny Sokol, who is the Carolyn Craig Franklin Chair in Law and Economics at the USC Gould School of Law and an affiliate professor of business at the Marshall School of Business. Danny also serves as a part-time senior advisor at White & Case. He's among the 10 most cited antitrust law professors in the past 5 years, and his work focuses on complex business issues from early startups to multinational businesses, and in particular issues regarding competition. To Danny's left is Debbie Feinstein. She heads Arnold & Porter's Global Antitrust Group. She returned to A&P after serving as the director of FTC's Bureau of Competition. During her tenure, the FTC had a lot of litigation success, including a number of major merger wins. Before that, I would add, Debbie and I worked together on many, I don't think hundreds is an exaggeration, it might even be thousands of deals when I was in-house. Debbie has been consistently ranked as a leading practitioner by many major publications, including Global Lawyer of the Year by the Global Competition Review. And finally, to Debbie's left, John Mayo is the Elsa Carlson McDonough Chair of Business Administration and Professor of Economics, Business and Public Policy at Georgetown. He's also the Executive Director, along with Jeff, of the Center for Business and Public Policy, our host today. John's research interests lie in the application of microeconomics to public policy, published over 100 journals, monographs, book chapters, including a textbook on regulation and antitrust. So with that, let's begin the discussion. I'm going to throw out some questions, ask the panelists to react, and then discuss among themselves if they are willing. We will run through some questions, and then please be thinking about where you'd like to fill in the gaps at the end. So I'm going to start with sort of a broad question to set the stage. I'd like each of you, and Maureen, perhaps you could kick us off, to describe at a high level how efficiencies, I need to choose my word correct, have been viewed to date in US merger analysis. Let's sort of get up to sort of the near present time before we start talking about how people are proposing to, or in fact starting to change some of the ways of looking at efficiencies. So from the standpoint, say, of enforcement policy from the US agencies, Maureen, how have we been looking at efficiencies up to this point?
Well, looking to the evolution of the merger guidelines, what we've seen is that the policy going back to at least as early as 1992 has been focused on consumer welfare. And that includes recognizing that consumers can be better off when a merger results, a merger results, I should say, in a more efficient firm, because a more efficient firm can compete more vigorously. And you can see this language, you can kind of trace it through each iteration of the horizontal merger guidelines. So the 1992 guidelines indicate the agencies may choose not to challenge a merger if it creates significant net efficiencies, but they have to be greater if the competitive risks are higher. And then the 1997 guidelines reframe efficiencies as part of the question of whether the overall effect of a merger will be anti-competitive in any particular market. But interestingly, it allows that even out-of-market efficiencies could sway the agencies not to challenge a merger if they're inextricably linked to the market of concern, such that the divestiture in the affected market would not be possible without giving up that benefit to consumers. And then later guidelines adopt this test as a matter of prosecutorial discretion. And the 2010 guidelines continue the trend of blending the analysis of harms and efficiencies into a single inquiry about the results for consumers. The 2020 vertical merger guidelines, which have been rescinded, take the same basic approach of collapsing the harms and efficiencies analysis into a single question about anti-competitive effect. And they embrace the idea that mergers shouldn't be blocked if the prevailing effect is to lower costs to consumers by lowering transaction costs among complementary business units, or by eliminating double marginalization for the merged firm. And then importantly, this hasn't just been limited to the US. The US agency heads from both parties over the past 20 years have urged harmony with this consumer welfare approach in foreign jurisdictions. So as we all know, and I'm sure many of the mergers you talked about probably had to be reviewed around the world, right, and before other antitrust agencies. And so to have a common standard for what the how a merger would be evaluated, what are the goals of merger review, is very, very important. And so the US agencies helped found the International Competition Network in 2001 to promote international convergence around these types of issues and around procedural issues. And so we've heard agency heads from both political parties recognize the central roles of efficiency and antitrust analysis. So just kind of looking, at least from the guidelines and from public statements, efficiencies have been a very important part of any antitrust analysis.
Good, thank you. So Debbie, let me turn to you as we move from enforcement policy as it has been stated and described by the agencies in particular the various merger guidelines. You know, a lot of your work has been in the translation of those policies to practice. Can you talk a little bit about, in your experience, how the agencies have thought about efficiencies when they actually look at a deal in front of them?
Great, thanks for having me here today and on this great panel. The agencies do pay attention to mergers, absolutely. At the Federal Trade Commission, there's a Bureau of Economics, which has both economists and financial analysts who look carefully at any proffered efficiencies for any deal. And I will say that I can remember cases when I was there where the Bureau of Economics said, absolutely, there will be efficiencies from this deal. Maybe not as much as the parties suggested, but still they would acknowledge them. I can think of one very significant case where the Bureau of Competition, the lawyers recommended a case. The economists recommended against a case, in part because of the efficiencies of the transaction. So they look at them very closely. There is, to be sure, a degree of skepticism about whether efficiencies will exist, whether they will be merger specific, in other words, whether they could have been achieved absent the merger, and whether or not they will actually benefit consumers as opposed to just going into line the pockets of the company. So they're skeptical about all that, and they look at it very carefully. As a result, there's a little bit of a chicken and egg issue. I can honestly say that in the 4 years that I was there the second time, I can think of one case where I think efficiencies actually made a difference to the outcome. You know, does that say that there aren't efficiencies? No. What it says is in deals that are really problematic, even if there are efficiencies that may be enough, and in deals that are unproblematic, there may be lots of efficiencies, but it didn't matter because the deal was unproblematic on competitive effects. What you see is rare cases where efficiency tips the balance of, wow, we would have had a real concern, but wow, there are all these efficiencies, so let's let it clear. As a result of that, parties don't spend a lot of time talking to the agencies about efficiencies because they think, well, it's really not going to matter anyway. I'm going to have to show that the merger is not anti-competitive. The way it does matter, and the way when I'm appearing before the agencies that we often articulate the efficiencies, is this is part of the deal rationale. I do think that if there are at least proffered efficiencies, and the government sort of has an instinctive view that maybe there are going to be some, even if they don't meet all of the requirements of the merger guidelines, they'll think, okay, well, at least it tells me there's not an anti-competitive motive for the deal. The parties at least believe there are going to be efficiencies, and that's motivating them. And while intent is not a requirement of Section 7, you don't have to show that the deal was motivated by ill intent to find that it will have an adverse effect on competition. Certainly, if you find that the deal was motivated by bad intent, you're more likely to think, well, yeah, maybe there is going to be an effect. Whereas if the deal is motivated by good intentions, you may still think there's going to be an effect, but it will it will play a role in how you think about things. So I do think that even if it's sort of in the subconscious way of, gee, are these people really thinking of raising prices, or do they think that they're going to get efficiencies? I think that factors into the holistic look that the agencies will give a transaction. When it comes to court, and the agencies are a little bit having it both ways. If you read the briefs, on the one hand, they'll acknowledge that their own guidelines say that efficiencies ought to be taken into account, but they will almost always mention, but of course, we're not sure that the Supreme Court will accept them. So when it comes to their practice, when it comes to litigating it, they're a little more on the fence. I should say more recently, the Department of Justice has staked out a pretty extensive view of what it takes to actually show efficiencies in a merger challenge. And I think you will see, as we'll talk about later, more aggressiveness on that front in practice.
Great. Okay, so Debbie, you've already started to move us from the agency phase of a merger review to court. So Professor Sokol, I'm sure you have a very succinct, elegant way of explaining to your students how efficiencies come into play in merger analysis, and we would like to hear it now.
It tends to be very short because the kind of cases that you find are going to be unlike what you see in front of the agencies, right? So there's a certain amount of selectivity bias. If the efficiencies were really, really strong, agencies aren't bringing these cases, right? So it's going to be cases that are close. And these are both cost-based efficiencies and also non-price type based efficiencies. On the price-based efficiencies, most of the cases, let me be clear, we don't have a Supreme Court decision directly on efficiencies since the late 60s. Oftentimes forgotten, perhaps, by the current administration, is that actually the closest we'll come to it is probably General Dynamics that was decided in the early 70s that begins to open us up to efficiencies analysis. But this has basically been decided by the circuit courts, largely the DC Circuit, but not exclusively, and the lower courts, largely the District of Columbia, but again, not exclusively. The closest we get to efficiencies are really, really going to matter, T-Mobile, in a footnote. But even there we get, hold on, we're not going to decide this just on efficiencies. So the answer is, it comes up all the time. Most of the time they parrot the guidelines, and most of the time it is not dispositive at all. The closest we got to it was a cert petition to the Supreme Court for an insurance merger, and the Supreme Court chose not to address mergers. So we get it from the lower courts. What really matters, number one, AAG Cantor loves Bob Potofsky, your former colleague, and indeed the former dean at the law school here at Georgetown. Potofsky is the one that introduced the 1997 changes, specifically introducing that efficiency section in the merger guidelines. He believed in efficiencies. I assume AAG Cantor also believes in efficiencies. And what do we see there? It was actually helpful. Why? Because we literally get that language repeatedly in court decisions, in the lower court decisions. So do we really see how it plays out? Not really. We see even less of it we just get it parroted. So it's clear that courts believe that it matters, but it's not really the central focus. And again, it's part of the selection bias that if it was really, really that strong, we wouldn't see it in the case. So here's the one area we don't see it at all. What about the situation? Prices go up, but non-price effects go up even more than the price effects. How would we address that? Unknown question. And it's one that I've often wondered in the healthcare context. And my guess is from when you were at the agency or when you were at the agency, those kinds of cases didn't get challenged because they probably, if they exist, were handled at the agency level, and you didn't have to try those cases. But overall, there's a lot we still don't know, and we have a very narrow view of efficiencies, but we'll talk more about that later.
Great. Okay, so John, to round out this first pass at sort of what we have, how we have been thinking to date about efficiencies, from the economics point of view, I mean, an undergraduate comes into, micro and macro, and they start learning about efficiency as a sort of singular noun, and Now we're talking about efficiencies, and it seems like maybe we're talking about different things, but can you kind of give us a synthesis of how an economist typically thinks about this question?
Sure. I am at risk, though, of introducing very basic preliminary concepts when I've just heard 3 expert discussions. From an economics perspective, and just in the spirit of stage setting, exchange is really central to our discipline. Exchange of goods and services across consumers create the prospect, the likelihood of increased utility. And exchange of assets across firms, mergers and acquisitions, create the prospect of increased value and improved efficiency. That is just a basic tenet of the discipline of economics. And it's something that we live with as a reality in our field and have for decades and decades, if not centuries. The way that most industrial organization economists who study antitrust economics come to think about efficiencies in the context of antitrust probably came through the lens of Oliver Williamson in a 1968 seminal paper in the American Economic Review, in which he offered a completely simple, completely elegant description of a nettlesome case, not the easy case where a merger has efficiencies and no market power effects. Of course, you want to improve that merger, nor the case of a merger where you have market power effects and no efficiencies. Of course, you want to deny that merger. But the nettlesome case of when you have both efficiencies and market power effects. And the description was a conceptual one, but it compelled us in the discipline to start to think about a balancing act, about thinking part and parcel of mergers as possibly including and the likelihood of both market power effects and efficiencies. And that really is a very simple and but I think powerful shift away from a world where you only think about market power effects. And as I said, it compels a balancing act. The balancing act, I think, became manifest in the 92, 97 merger guidelines and have continued up until this day. The particulars of those merger guidelines, we can talk about. But I think the important thing from the economic perspective is that balancing act exists, that the particular way it has manifested itself is embodied in the evolution of the merger guidelines. And by and large, I think to your question, Mark, about what's been the perspective over the last 40 years or so, I would say that by and large, the important takeaway is that there's been a general consensus from the economics perspective that good economics is embodied in the evolution of the guidelines.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. Good first pass at these issues. I want to now sort of migrate from current state or pre-existing state of the law and policy to where we're going. And I want to focus, maybe Maureen, you could kick us off on this one, on some of the primary criticisms of efficiencies analysis by those who are advocating reform, sometimes sweeping reform in antitrust generally and in thinking about efficiencies in particular.
So the current leadership at the FTC and in some other, possibly DOJ and certainly in some influential organizations and members of Congress is pushing this idea that this was never mentioned in the statute, right? And we should just sort of go back to like just old interpretations and not look at sort of the evolution of the law over time to accept things like efficiencies. And what they're looking for is to move away from this effects-based analysis, much more towards a simple kind of yes or no presumption that a merger is anti-competitive based on things like market share, pattern of consolidation in the industry, or that the acquiring firm is already dominant or dominant in at least some market. And then once these kind of like yes or no tests are met, the inquiry should cease, and efficiency should just not be considered. They don't like things like taking into account the elimination of double marginalization and other widely accepted efficiencies. And we've seen this. Chair Khan used to work at Open Markets. Open Markets urged that a merger that threatens to reduce competition should not be allowed on efficiency grounds. So pretty clear statement there. The House of Representatives, their investigation of competition in digital markets said something similar, that a merger that would result in efficiency should not be sufficient to overcome the presumption that it's anti-competitive. Presumption, right? Not proving that it's anti-competitive. Similar statements made when the majority at the FTC withdrew the vertical merger guidelines. And so one of the issues here is focusing a lot more on the idea that there are market structures that help either protect or threaten competition. And so that we should just be really looking to those and not trying to tease out what an effect might be. I personally think one of the problems with that, it kind of moves away from the idea, or moves toward the idea, that all markets are the same and that they operate the same, and that you don't need to get into sort of those messy details about how competition actually works in a particular market. The idea that if the market has, 10 equal sized competitors, where, it's great and that's the best outcome for consumers. That's my take. I'm not saying they said that, but that's the idea, that there are particular structures and we shouldn't move away from.
You open it up to the rest of the panel. How do you perceive the reform narrative's take on efficiencies, and how do you react to it? Danny.
So very quickly, 3 points. Number one, I find it very peculiar that people who otherwise abhor originalism in law on every other topic seem to push it in antitrust, and uniquely in antitrust. I just note this inconsistency. Number two, what Maureen talks about, this focus on structuralism from an economic standpoint, by the late 70s, early 80s, it was clear that the SEP approach had limits, and economics had moved beyond that. I think this is fairly well understood, but even there, it's sort of going back to the 68 guidelines is bizarre, because Williamson at the time created those guidelines, believe it or not, as a way to rein in some of the excesses of the early to mid 60s, based on what became the famous article in the AER. So that would suggest a sort of more legislative history type approach is also missing from many of the critiques. So they're either selectively originalists or selectively not looking at legislative type history. But the third point, I think one that's important, is everything gets conflated as somehow an efficiency. Most deals are not focused on antitrust grounds. So look at the finance literature, look at the strategy literature, look at the operations type literature. The efficiencies are real there, we see empirically, but mostly, like, why are a lot of deals proposed? Has nothing to do with competition, has to do with tax. Largely also end of the year, oh my God, we have to offset, these tax losses. Can we acquire a company that actually has a lot of losses because we have a lot of gains, for example? Or there's a nice sort of financial opportunity here to do something we might not have otherwise used to the deal structure. So most deals actually have nothing to do with competitive effects one way or the other. The efficiencies part is a small part of deals, but I think goes to a broader conceptualization that we hear articulated both by the current agency leadership and certainly by the related think tanks, which is somehow, and members of Congress, big is bad. So any kind of deal is illegitimate. We actually see pushes to stop mergers generally, largely framed as a competition matter, when most deals are in fact not based on competitive effects. I'll stop there.
Debbie.
A couple of things. I think there's the micro view of efficiencies and the macro view of efficiencies. The micro view of efficiencies is we've just counted, we've trusted the parties too much when they've said they're going to be efficiencies. We haven't been sufficiently skeptical and, they haven't proven to us that the efficiencies actually happened. Of course, there isn't really a lot of incentive for companies to go back after their deal is cleared and say, we told you so. Why are they going to spend the money to do that? They often tell their shareholders that, though. I can think of a deal I did several decades ago, a grocery store deal where we told the government we were going to get a lot of efficiencies. That was the deal rationale. There were a few areas of overlap. We did divestitures. And the next year they told their shareholders, and here's how much we got in cost savings. We told you we were, and we did. And then they told them the next year and the next year. So it was clearly laid out to the world. And you see that. We just didn't write a letter to the government saying, by the way, we weren't kidding about the efficiencies, because why would you do that? So I think, and the agencies themselves haven't, because again, why are you going to look at a deal you've cleared to see if the efficiencies actually happened, is probably not the best use of resources to determine that. So that's the micro view of, the narrow proverb efficiencies. The macro concern they have about efficiencies is that it imbues every decision that's ever been made. Their view is that the HHI thresholds, the thresholds of concentration set forth in the guidelines, are there because we presume that there's some level of efficiency, so we don't have to worry about it. I don't know that that's at all right. I think it's just that there's a view that at some level of concentration, there's enough competition, you don't need to worry. It's not that we've assumed efficiencies into it, but I think that's how they think about it. The notion that we want there, when we're doing analyses and modeling, to have some level of price effect over a de minimis amount, I think a lot of folks think, well, that's just because you're giving an efficiencies credit, and that's why you want it to be above a certain number. And I think a lot of people think, well, no, it should just be above a certain number, because if all you can show is a 1% price increase in some economic model, that's not sufficiently different from zero to be persuasive. So I don't think there's as much building in of efficiencies as folks think, but I think that a lot of the current leadership thinks that's why all these decisions have been made. And if we say efficiencies are unlikely, we should ratchet back. We should say any price increase is a problem, even if it's in some economic model, which has a lot of built-in assumptions that one can question. We should assume that the concentration levels should be much lower because they've been built on an assumption there are a lot of efficiencies. I think those are the two ways that the leaders are now thinking about it.
Great. John, your thoughts on the reform narrative on efficiencies? And
so in terms of tensions, I think it's easy to point toward the emerging tensions. Let me get to that. But I do think that there's a predicate story and that we want to pause on, and that is, again, harkening back to my earlier comments, that for the last 40 years or so, there's been the story is there's been a general consensus in the economics community, in the policy community, in the enforcement community on an approach toward efficiencies that has been one, and I'll just characterize this generally as skepticism, but overcomable skepticism. There's probably a more eloquent way to say that: skepticism, but overcomable skepticism. And to the extent that that has been in play for a long time, you have to ask the question, well, where are we going to go now? And I think there is some concern. If you read the various narratives that are emerging these days, that consensus is going to go away. Now, I don't have tension about where we've been. I have some tension about where we may be going. The notion that we will, and I'll overstate the case here, that we will kick economics to the curb and just pull out a big red pen and mark an X through the efficiency sections of the merger guidelines would create a lot of tension for the economics community. I'll say that.
yeah, and just to add, I think very helpful. Thank you, all of you. Debbie and I have had this conversation in the context of a number of specific deals. My first question to business people when they came to me with a merger and so wanted the assessment of its prospects for clearance was, tell me why you're doing it. And I wanted to look at their documents too, to see what they said to themselves about why they were doing it. And so if they didn't tell me a story that I could understand, and if there were any embedded, overlaps, competitive issues, then then we were going to be having a very long extended discussion because already I was on alert, okay, where this is going. But most of the time, the story, as Debbie put it, was I could understand it. And as Danny suggested, often it had nothing to do with anything that would be an efficiency that would plug in directly into the guidelines analysis. Now, often it did. In some industries, there are roll-ups that are all about cost. And just one other anecdote, and then I want to turn to another question. I mean, I brought a business leader into the Petofsky FTC, and Bob was, for all of his, centrist sort of views on many things, I mean, he really wanted to understand everything, including efficiencies. So he brought business people in to talk about efficiencies. We sat in tell me about, like, why do you do deals and what are they all about? And we had a business deal person talk about why he did deals, what he thought made sense. And one of the things he said was, if somebody brought me a revenue synergy, particularly if it had anything to do with price, well, first of all, he knew enough, a lot of his staff didn't, to know that that was an antitrust red flag. But he also said he was deeply skeptical of any such thing because it just didn't happen in the real world. Whereas, he said, if they bring me a cost story, I'm very interested in that. And, he said, I can point to, and we did retrospectives to show, he said, I hit my cost targets in these deals, one after another after another. Now, that was then, this is now, that was one point in time at one company. But just the narrative that some things were very uncertain about and other things were quite certain about. Cost savings were something that a lot of the business people I worked with, you can take cost out. You can't necessarily keep all the revenue and all the synergy that you want to achieve, but you can take cost out. Okay, let's turn to another question. I want to talk a little bit about where we're going in policy. So, and Danny, maybe you can kick us off on this. The merger guidelines are being relooked. We may be seeing, I guess, a new draft anytime now. The agency sort of spelled out to some extent what they were looking at with this request for information. And there was a section on efficiencies. Can you talk about that section, what questions were asked, and sort of where you think the things may be heading?
One, I think they're asking the right questions. Are efficiencies real? Two, the framing is a little bit different than what we've seen before. Very selective in terms of cases and language where you see that they're pushing in a particular direction. So they're just like, well, we have a Supreme Court case from the 60s, P&G, that says efficiencies are illegal. Comment. Ignoring many, many cases that acknowledge efficiencies. There's one aspect where, again, they're asking the right questions in some ways of like, we're concerned about the anti-competitive effects. I think we should all be concerned. There's a lot that the agencies don't ask, and part of the reason they don't ask is a different kind of chicken and egg problem. Companies don't keep certain kinds of data that would get to certain kinds of efficiencies that we don't normally credit. Why? Because they're not credited. Maybe they should be credited. So I'll give you both an efficiency story and an inefficiency story, neither of which get credited by the agencies. So on the efficiency side, does Georgetown have in the business school an operations department?
Yeah.
So congratulations, because every single MBA student then has played the beer game. It's a wonderful optimization game to try to understand efficiencies in a supply chain. This is not what the FTC or DOJ have ever really thought about. You mentioned the beer game, and they're just like, yeah, that's what happens at 6 p.m. at Fadod, just around the corner here in Chinatown. So you're not always seeing the right kind of questions being asked, and this is historically, it's a very narrow view, purely econ view of efficiencies. There are other things that matter. For example, you might imagine information leakage in terms of trade secrets in a contractual-based supply chain, that if it's all within the same company, you would have less leakage of trade secret information. We know this empirically. It's just not in the econ literature. It's in related literature. Problem. But what are the agencies also not asking about in terms of bad effects that would be helpful? So I'm going to give you an example of that too, that should inform how we think about efficiencies. So we look, oh, there might be real efficiencies. Company A merges with company B. You know what would create inefficiencies that I've never seen in a retrospective? How about the business enterprise software that they use? So Target has SAP, whereas the acquirer has Oracle. We can even play the same game, different versions of Oracle, different legacy versions. And they're like, great, we've just merged. And then you go, oh my God, how much money will it cost to actually integrate the underlying business enterprise software? And then they just sort of keep it as separate units, and they don't really integrate the way that they had planned, because this is just not the presentations you get. I think these are real problems. I think the agency should also look at problems that they haven't looked at before to really get to how real are the efficiencies. And I think that that would solve a lot of the problems that we have. We say like, well, why didn't the efficiencies work out? Or how about we have personality clashes? We know that that really matters in terms of empire building by the acquirer. We don't credit that as well, but you know what? It turns out, if you look at Delaware corporate law, we have a solution to that. They say, guess what? Here's your deal. Here are the risk shifting provisions. The market will ultimately decide. Could these savings be real? And are you basically doing what you need to do to benefit shareholders? So we don't always ask the right questions one way or the other, but it turns out that ultimately the market tells us whether or not these work better than Delaware corporate judges who don't step in to stop mergers that we think are stupid. And frankly, antitrust agencies also don't step in. So I won't embarrass Mark, but in his current capacity, by Will in his prior capacity, GE Honeywell was a disaster of a deal, purely from not the antitrust side. We could debate that. In fact, we did see this debate between US and Europe. No, it was a stupid business deal. But that's not why the Europeans tried to block the deal, not saying, oh my God, this is dumb. They said, oh my God, we think the competitive effects are bad. I'll stop there.
It might actually have been why the deal didn't happen at the end, because business leadership might, in theory, have realized that it wasn't a great deal. But no thanks to the commission, I have to say. Let me just, Maureen, thoughts on the RFI from your perspective as a recent enforcer?
Yeah, sure. So one point that I wanted to mention is that the RFI implies skepticism towards certain types of merger efficiencies, like scale-driven reductions in labor costs or capacity. And scale-driven reductions in labor costs or capacity are commonly understood to be the type of horizontal merger efficiencies that result in lower prices to consumers, because the firm doesn't need to reduce output to achieve the cost savings. So you're starting kind of with skepticism of something that I think is a pretty well-established benefit. So, but their concern really seems to be driven towards achieving benefits that come with protecting competitors and not competition, or sponsoring more jobs or creating redundancies in the supply chain, right? So we see a lot of concerns about labor issues and not that it's anti-competitive for labor, but that might reduce employment. Which is interesting given that we are not in a time of high unemployment. It's kind of the reverse. People are looking for workers. And then obviously supply chain redundancies have been an important issue. And while these all may be admirable goals, they're not really the goals of antitrust law, right? And so the Supreme Court has, going back to the 50s, talked about antitrust is about the best allocation of our economic resources. The lowest price is the highest quality and the greatest material progress. So that's an area that concerns me, that we might discard something that has, kind of shown to be beneficial to achieve goals that are not antitrust goals.
Other thoughts on the revisions process and the request for information?
I think, well, I don't know that it's just about the RFI, but it's about the skepticism about efficiencies and the under enforcement of antitrust laws. Is I think that antitrust is trying to do, I think some of the progressives are trying to make antitrust do too much. Let me give you an example. And I heard flavors of this even decades ago, but it never played out. I was doing a different grocery store deal. And one of our big arguments, because this was decades ago, was that Walmart was coming. Walmart was coming. Walmart was very efficient. It was low cost. There's no question that Walmart charges lower prices for their groceries. None. It's just not a debate. But It also means it drives out inefficient competitors, and it may destroy, the little Main Street store. Okay, those may be social ills, but they're not what antitrust is about. Antitrust is about consumer welfare in terms of economic efficiency, lower prices, that sort of thing. And yet I heard a staff lawyer say, well, when Walmart enters, that's bad because concentration goes up. Well, the reason that concentration goes up when Walmart enters is because it drives out inefficient competitors. And so you may have 3 or 4, big national chains, but that doesn't mean that prices have gone up. It doesn't mean that service has gone down. It means that the mom and pop store that just charges higher prices isn't as low price as it was. Now, does that mean that store necessarily goes out of business? That depends a lot on whether or not consumers value. I pay higher prices for things all the time because of the convenience. I'm sure everybody in this room has not always gone to the cheapest dry cleaner or the cheapest grocery store, do you always buy the cheapest coffee? I'm guessing you don't always buy the cheapest coffee. You buy what you like because it's on the way. You buy it because the quality is good. And so all of those things, the marketplace does speak. But there's this sense that anytime there's efficiency, that if it leads to somebody going out of business or leads to some other effect, that's naturally a problem. And I just don't think it is. And I think that's what's imbuing a lot of the thinking now about this. You saw there was a letter today, a little off topic, but gets to this big point, a letter today from a number of senators basically saying they didn't want the tech companies to enter the automotive industry. Because that would be bad. And my head is spinning. As antitrust lawyers, we want entry. We think entry is a good thing. We think that innovation is a good thing. And basically having Congress say, oh, some people should not be allowed to innovate or enter is a little turning all of this upside down. And I worry that's what the jettisoning of efficiencies is part of.
John?
So when I looked at the questions in the RFI, sometimes questions are just questions, in which case you accept them as neutral questions. Sometimes they pretend a message of where people want to go. Reading it in the latter context, there are a couple of things that were troubling, I think, in the RFI questions. One had to do with the point, Danny, that you brought up, and that is the nominal presumption that the treatment of efficiencies for the last 40 years has been at odds with the legal structure in the United States. I'm not a lawyer, but I have a tough time with that one. The second implicit thing that is going on, I think, is something that you spoke to, Debbie, is that I am worried in the questions that it pretends an expansion of goal setting away from the rather singular focus on consumers and consumer welfare. So when you get a question that points toward should, or ask the question, should redundant capacity, should a redundant input be counted as an efficiency? If you can eliminate that redundant capacity, that would not be even a question for mainstream economists and lawyers 20 years ago, and yet it is very much teed up as a question today because it is in the context of labor. It doesn't matter that it's cost savings, it matters that you want to protect labor in that case. Okay.
Thank you all. So we started a little late, so I have 2 or 3 topics I want to cover with the panel. I'm going to tell you what they are because we had a longer list. And then I am going to save time for Q&A. And if we need to go past 12:15, the cutoff time for the program for Q&A, you're welcome to stay, ask your questions. Can you all stay for a few minutes? Good. Okay. So here are the topics I want to cover with the panel. And let's try to be succinct because I want to at least get them out there. And the 3 things on our agenda I want to cover are vertical mergers versus horizontal. I want to talk a little bit about remedies. And I want to talk about sort of the empirical story that underlies this whole reform initiative, including the skepticism in some quarters of efficiencies. So if we could start with vertical mergers, and John, maybe you can go first.
Okay.
And on the analysis, horizontal versus vertical, where are we today and where do you think we might be heading?
Okay, So I'll try to be as brief as possible on this, given the time. There is a discussion about should we treat vertical efficiencies in the context of vertical mergers differently than in horizontal context. And I think for 3 reasons, the answer is yes. One is there are nuanced theories of harm and nuanced theories of efficiencies that are different in a horizontal context in a vertical context. Secondly, specifically with respect to efficiencies in a vertical context, we have really, really long-running and venerable discussions and analysis of vertical efficiencies that date back in the context of what is now called the elimination of double marginalization, dating back to seminal work by Augustine Cournot in the mid-1900s, popularized this century, that is important to think about in the context of vertical mergers that doesn't happen necessarily in the context of horizontal mergers. Also, the seminal thread of work begun by Ronald Coase with his work on the theory of the firm that points out that firms organize themselves in cost minimizing ways, including the cost of transacting business. And that too is a very important thread in vertical that I think is not necessarily as present in a horizontal context. And the final thing I think that is at play goes back to that earlier work that I mentioned by Williamson, who, despite the elegance of that article, is constrained in 2 ways. One is, while it conjectures its applicability in a vertical context, it does not demonstrate that in a formal sense. And secondly, the Williamson analysis is done in a context of a strictly up or down decision about whether to challenge a merger. There are no possibilities, and Mark, you mentioned remedies. There's no possibility of a remedy in that context. And so it turns out that, and thank you for asking the question, my co-author, Mark Whitener, and I last year did a study that relaxed those 2 assumptions about the Williamson analysis and found that lo and behold, when you work with remedies and you incorporate remedies into a vertical analysis, the potential for additional welfare gains accrue beyond that is available in a horizontal context. And I'll leave it with that.
Good. Okay, other thoughts on vertical? I want to give everybody a chance to at least weigh in briefly. Yes.
The only thing I would add about some of the concerns that we're hearing about vertical and sort of dismiss and acting like vertical mergers are even more concerning than horizontal mergers, which is a little bit of a change from the typical view, is I think it goes back to this idea of concerns outside the traditional consumer welfare standard of just having big companies and the political impacts and the social impacts of having big. So even if it's a vertical merger, if it's a big company getting bigger, that seems to drive some of the, like antitrust must be missing something here.
2 very quick thoughts. Number 1, Jeff, who introduced himself earlier, is well-dressed. I'm not going to question that. I will also say Jeff has one of the better, which is best literature reviews on transaction cost economics. So this is a bit of Georgetown self-preferencing. But I want to say we don't really have a lot of vertical merger cases. Why? Because they get settled in consents, which suggests implicitly, since they're in consents, there's more pro-competitive than anti-competitive. There's enough anti-competitive that we should be concerned, but the agencies are really addressing this. And even Steve Salop, who actually also seems to believe that vertical is more problematic, when he points to the successes, it's all like, look at the consents. So we have a disconnect about like, are consents good or consents bad? The only other thing I would simply add is there's true vertical, and then there's what we call in the merger guidelines the diagonal markets. Maybe we call them adjacent markets. But I think there's a lot of potential efficiencies there as well. And we've seen this empirically shown in a number of acquisition-based industries, for example, in biotech, both on the pharma side and on the device side. And on devices, Jeff is also a big expert.
So, yeah. Just an aside on that last comment, and when I was running non-merger enforcement at the FTC in the mid-90s, I had a very good section chief assistant director come to me with a case, and I said, is it horizontal or vertical? And he said, well, it's not really horizontal. It's not really vertical. It's diagonal. And I hadn't heard that word before in that context. And of course, we all got a big laugh out of it. Well, funny me, a couple of decades later, it's now building into the literature. I'll put quotation marks around that. Okay. You've segued us into remedies, both John and Danny. And Debbie, can you take us a step further on that? And I'm thinking in particular, and this issue has now been flagged about sort of how do we look at negotiated remedies? The agencies are expressing a great deal of skepticism about them. You can point to remedies that probably weren't executed or designed well, so you got to find those and fix them. But the broader skepticism, how do you see that as a practitioner and a former enforcer?
Remedies are often very valuable and they can work. And the remedy study that we did when I was there showed that the vast majority of them were in fact successful. Are there failures? Yes. But what I would say is if you bring lawsuits, there will be failures as well. If you make decision to block a merger, you may be making a bad decision. If you make a decision not to block a merger, you may be making a bad decision. Anybody who thinks they are going to get 100% perfection on any of this, I'm sorry, I just think that is not realistic. So you're balancing. Do I think this remedy will probably work versus what happens if I go into court with this? And I can contrast a couple of things. When we looked at the Cisco deal, we spent an inordinate amount of time in this public that we had thought about this, thinking about the remedy. And I remember there were times where I thought, wow, all this time I'm spending thinking about the remedy, they're getting ready to, be ready to litigate with us if we don't. And I debated at times, should we just go to court? And I thought, no, I have an obligation to see if we can get a remedy that a majority of the commission will be on board with. I think that is my job here as bureau director, is not to just sort of say, give the back of the hand. And we spent a lot of time, and for a variety of reasons, we just couldn't get comfortable there. Contrast that with the ARDA case, which was about bottlers, and it was just a question of how many bottling plants they were going to litigate. We sued. There had been no discussion of remedies. They discussed it for the first time in court, and the remedy wasn't good enough. The remedy wasn't good enough. The remedy wasn't good enough. And then finally it was good enough. And we quickly settled. We were ready to settle because we thought we had gotten to that point where we were okay. And sometimes you may be willing to basically let the parties go out and get their perfect remedy and still challenge it in court and say it's not enough, because in a little bit, you're playing with the house's money. In the best case, you block the whole merger if you think the remedy isn't going to work. In the worst case, you lose, but at least you've got some remedy. The problem is that the agencies are going so far, I think, and I think that you saw a little bit of this in the United Health case. Put aside the vertical aspect of that case, there was a horizontal aspect of the case too, and the parties litigated the fix. They basically said, there isn't an issue because we're going to divest. And the government and the parties, I think, had different views of what the appropriate standard was. Should the remedy fully solve the problem that already exists, or does the court take a look at the transaction as remedy? And the court did the latter, and as a result, I think made it harder for the government in other cases to basically challenge a fix. And by not entering into a remedy, what it means is you don't get to have input into who the buyer is. You don't get to have oversight. You don't get to have all of the bells and whistles that you would have. So saying that you're just playing with the house's money and you're going to get some remedy anywhere doesn't fully answer the question. There are also often times where the merger may be very good across 90% of the revenues of the company. And there may be some tiny little problem over here. Is the right answer overall really to block that merger? I question that. And so I think you have to look at more broadly. And so you may, in a little area, take a remedy you're a little more nervous about, but it's absolutely the best that you can do under the circumstances to basically get this overall benefit. So I think there's a lot to think about. And I think simply saying remedies don't always work, therefore we're not going to have them, I don't think is probably the best policy.
And just to add that to Debbie's last point, and going back to John's comment about the excellent Mayo and Whitener piece, the small piece of the big deal, and particularly, I think, John, in the vertical context, imagine a deal, and we've all seen many of them. There is a identifiable horizontal issue. It's fundamentally vertical, and we can see a lot of sort of vertical synergies and specifically EDM. And there might be also a vertical concern about post-merger conduct. Well, the way those deals have been dealt with is divest the horizontal part. Maybe you have a conduct remedy on the vertical part, and then the very large, likely pro-competitive structure of the vertical transaction goes forward. And what I think, John, your work showed, extending the Williamson analysis to vertical mergers, was that unlocks a great deal of potential value if it's done right.
Just to hammer that home, Mark, the idea is you can construct remedies. You can't construct a remedy that says and you don't need to, it turns out, construct a remedy that says you have to implement the elimination of double marginalization.
Right.
The firms, if the merger goes through and it's vertical, they're going to do that of their own volition. Sweet. You've aligned the incentives of the agencies and the firms that are merging.
Okay, yes, go ahead.
So
Quickly.
if we think about the law and economics of settlement overall, there's a reason we do it. A, it reduces risk of losing one side or the other. B, it actually frees up resources. So our antitrust agencies are constrained. They do heroic jobs with small staffing and asymmetry of power in some ways. The problem is if you say, we're not taking remedies seriously, we're going to take everything to court. There are a lot of deals that are anti-competitive, that the agencies are just letting pass because they're focusing on a handful of deals where they don't like the remedies.
Okay. So the last question for the panel, and we'll open it up. And John, I'll ask you to go first again. So I think it's fair to say that we're seeing in the agency leadership statements and the reform narrative that sort of surrounds that a lot of skepticism about merger efficiencies, and whether they happen as often as they've been claimed, whether they are likely to be substantial, and a greater confidence level in the likelihood that a concentrating merger will produce competitive harm. So the harms are viewed as probable, the efficiencies probably not. Looking at this from a standpoint of either economic theory or empirical work, is that skepticism in those directions justified or not, in your view?
Well, this, of course, is a very, very important subject and topic. As an economist, you look at the full array. If you look at the full array of mergers, we know that lots of mergers happen every year that simply don't have any market power effects. So you have to default into the proposition that they're merging for something, probably for the belief that they have some cost efficiencies. Are those effects ubiquitous? No, they're not ubiquitous. And so that compels what you just asked about, and that is, what do we know from an empirical perspective about the presence of efficiencies? And here, unfortunately, I think there's a call to new research, but we've got more research over on the price side effects of mergers than we do on the efficiency side of mergers. That, unfortunately, I believe, has led to the ability for narratives to come up in the context of anecdotes that says, well, it turns out that here was a merger and it didn't look like there were any economic efficiencies in that. Aha, therefore efficiencies don't exist. That's going too far. It's not that there's a lot of research, but it's not that there's no research. We are right now directly opposite the Federal Trade Commission micro conference, at which this morning a paper was presented by two fine economists at MIT and Stanford, Demir and Garotman, that take a 20-year look at 5,000 M&As in the electric utility industry and demonstrate in a very, very rigorous fashion the presence of efficiencies. The same thing has happened in a variety of other industries. I think it's sad that there's not more research, but it's not as though there's no research. And so the narrative that is arising based on anecdotes, I think is unfortunate.
Yeah.
mean, and that's Margaret Slade and Francine LaFontaine did a very famous piece years ago on vertical mergers. And I remember, having read the paper and having cited the paper. And then when Francine became, bureau director of the economics group, I felt like I was meeting an econ rock star. It was, somebody who did. But the point was they had actually done empirical research on it. Could it be updated now? That's some years ago. But, that's the kind of thing. And I think when the government has done best at moving the law, moving cases, it's when there's been empirical research. First, you have the history of hospital merger enforcement, which went badly. They did empirical research. You have, a variety of things where generic drug competition and reverse patent settlements, they did the empirical research first, and then they brought the cases. I think there needs to be more of that.
Yeah, no, and as you and others have pointed out, firms are typically not in the business of going and doing a big post-acquisition, post-consolidation study of the efficiencies they got. The study is basically, how did I make my numbers next year, right? But just to go back to the anecdote of the business guy coming in talking to the commission about efficiencies. And he was asked, when you do cost synergy analysis pre-deal, is it bottom up? You just got to look at all the granular stuff and build it up and come up with a number, or is it top down? Do you sort of intuit a target and then work to hit it? And he very candidly said, oh, absolutely the latter. He said, we get a sense of this business. How does it fit? Do we have cost opportunities? What are they in general terms? The more we learn, the more we know. And then we come up with a target number, and then a gun's put to our head to hit the number, and we do. So again, probably doesn't build a really elegant efficiency study to go into the government with when you're trying to clear your deal, because you haven't done it in that way. You've done it in a very different way, but one that sometimes makes sense.
Just a footnote on that. In the Penguin Random House recent deal, the economic expert for the government argued that it was not valid to do a tops-down efficiency study, i.e., look at the two, see what they're doing, compare their P&Ls, do some numbers, look at deals that you've done before. You had to actually know each individual that you were going to make redundant. You had to look at every single contract and determine what the prices were going to be. It was her position that you could only do bottoms up, which is of course incredibly expensive, incredibly time consuming, means you have to have all kinds of clean teams because companies can't be sharing that kind of information.
Right.
I mean, it was basically a shocking view that was the only way you could ever do efficiencies.
Yeah. Danny, quickly, and then we'll get one more. Well, we're going to turn it over to the audience. So yes.
So one thing that complicates the efficiencies analysis after the fact is that incumbents reposition, and sometimes in ways that we don't anticipate. Thanks.
Okay. Okay. Your opportunity to ask questions, preferably questions, comments perhaps can be tolerated too. I saw your hand, and then Tim.
And the mics are coming.
Well,
Hi, I'm Alex Wilt. I'm with CTFN, a journalist. I was wondering, so there was discussion of remedies and sense of discussion of grocery deals. And so, especially in the past week, the remedy between Hagen, or like Safeway, Albertsons, and Hagen has come up. And we've also got another grocery deal maybe on the horizon. And I was wondering, like, if you have kind of that divestiture, that failed divestiture, even though no divestiture is perfect, and then you're also kind of trying to go into the agency with another grocery deal, what's your strategy kind of for that? Do you need to try to bring in efficiencies, but yet there's also skepticism of efficiencies? And I understand people could be limited in what they could say, but I'm just wondering.
Anybody who's not working the deal who would like to comment?
Kind of extracting it back from those deals that are in process right now. One of the things that was really useful, Debbie mentioned the remedies study that we did at the FTC, is also learning from that about what makes a remedy more efficient, more effective. And some of it was very much like process oriented, like, is there enough discussions with the monitoring trustee, right? Are there enough checkpoints along the way? Are there enough guardrails in there based on some of the failed remedies that the agency had experienced? So I don't know if anybody wants to weigh in more on that particular deal, but there's a lot that goes around making an effective remedy that maybe, is a little bit nuts and bolts, but we used our retrospective as a learning tool to improve the nuts and bolts part.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. It's really great to hear your perspective on mergers. And it's really exciting to hear it because it's at such a micro level and you're talking us through individual cases. I'm an economist, and one of the things I focus on is measuring productivity and efficiency. And I spent 5 years at the OECD. And one of the things that became quite obvious to us is that concentration across industries is increasing. But worryingly, business dynamism is going down. And like you said, one of the things about business dynamism is firm exit, which can be okay if they're facing competition. But the other side is that we're seeing fewer firms enter the market. And I think that's where the concern arises from a lot of economists that think that more attention needs to be focused on efficiency. And there's a lot of recent studies as well that have come out of the OECD that look at increased concentration with evidence of increase of markups. So my question is there something more that could be done by the agencies to try and help this? Or is it something else in the economy that's driving this concentration of markups that economists and researchers should focus on instead? Thank you.
Don?
Everyone's looking down here. A couple things. One is that I mentioned narratives and anecdotes. We need to, I think, be very careful right now about talking about increased concentration. The way you get to that conclusion requires that you measure markets correctly. And so if you measure markets at a national level, I'm going to take the case of the United States, you can identify that markets may be increasing in terms of concentration, partly for reasons that Deb mentioned of the big box stores getting a larger share. It's not clear that that is bad for consumers. It may be good for consumers. But if you measure concentration at a local level, some very good work by Stefan, I apologize, I've forgotten his last name, just for a moment, but a fine economist who was at Princeton, now at the University of Chicago, looked at concentration at a local level. It's actually falling. So it's really hard for economists to tell a story that concentration at a local level is falling and yet prices are going up. So I think we have a lot of work to do in that space. I think economists are really trying very hard to unpack the issue that you noted, which is a decreased propensity to enter markets in terms of business dynamism. I think the jury's still out, though. I don't know that we can attribute it all to market power.
I also think we're not very good at measuring quality, which you have to think about. You can't just look at price in the absence of quality. And I think that's a really hard thing. But go in any grocery store and you will see differences in quality, but also maybe associated with price increases. And some people would prefer to pay a higher price for higher quality, others not. And I don't think we've spent enough time thinking about how to measure that and how to bring that into the equation.
I'll just add, the economics literature is mixed. So we have studies like DeLoca on the one hand, but then we have papers like Foster et al., Rising Markups Are Changing Technology, a new NBER working paper that actually is like, are you kidding? The technological innovation getting to the non-price issues, that's where the value creation is. It's mixed, it's complicated, and because it is mixed and complicated, it doesn't play very well to political narratives tending to be on either extreme of the political divide.
May I just take one moment and correct my senior moment? The professor is Stefan Rossi Hansberg. Thank you.
Other questions?
Hi there, thanks for coming and talking today. So we mentioned briefly at different points, like larger companies existing. And one concern that I've seen expressed about that is the fact that there's a growing consolidation of consumer data, which on one hand can be really great, create efficiencies in advertising and marketing. On the other hand, it can expose consumers to having their private financial or health information kind of used internally by companies or sold to data brokers who might use it for less than great things like predatory lending or I don't know, variety of issues. Is that something that antitrust enforcers consider when looking at mergers, or do you think they should? Or is that kind of more on touching like other social ills that aren't antitrust concerns?
So let me jump in on this one because this is a topic I've thought a lot about and written on. So a couple things there. One, if you have a merger that is going to increase concentration in a particular market for consumer data that is not otherwise widely available in the market, and you're combining assets in a way that's going to allow them to gain market power. We have brought antitrust cases on that basis, things like credit data, things like, I think there was one, it had to do with like roof, like pictures of roofs all over the US, like that kind of.
The Veris
That was
case.
Veris, yes, yeah.
Calculating the square footage. basis.
Right. Right, so, kind of like everyone's individual house roof size. So there have been challenges brought on that. One of the issues, though, often has to do with the fact that concerns are being raised about data that is widely available in many, many sources. Data brokers way preceded the internet. They're still there. There's lots of sources of these data. It's easily replicated. It's all those kinds of things. So sometimes or often these concerns are being raised about that kind of data that's not giving anyone any particular market power. So in my view, it's not that these concerns are invalid. I mean, privacy is an important thing. Data security is an important thing. It's that antitrust isn't really the right tool for it. So to the extent that these concerns should be addressed more directly through a federal privacy law, or through, we have sort of a proliferation of state laws. Because one of the other things from the FTC, having also done the consumer protection side, is it's not really clear that the worst data breaches or data problems have come from big companies. Certainly they get a lot of attention, but small companies also might have very sensitive data. I think about the Ashley Madison case where the FTC brought an enforcement action where that leak led to reportedly some people committing suicide, right? So I think, if it's not creating like an increase in market power, it's just creating a privacy concern. Having sort of a federal or overarching privacy law is really the best way to address that.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question, if there is one. Just about wrapped up. Yes.
Hi, thank you for coming to speak today. Really interesting discussion. Professor Sokol mentioned the selection bias that the enforcing agencies have when they select cases that they have to take on, and also how strapped for resources they tend to be. A lot of people have called, including Senator Klobuchar, have called for an increase in the FTC filing fees for large companies. How important do you think that is as a policy change in the future? I think there's policy moving through legislation right now that's possibly gonna pass, but how important do you think that is as a future policy update?
Can I make a quick comment as a moderator? And so first of all, article John and I have coming out in the Antitrust magazine summarizes some of the other work that he and others have done. But one of the findings of one of the studies that John conducted was that increasing agency budgets is measurably effective in increasing agency output. Right? Not shocking, but there it was, right? And it wouldn't necessarily have been true, but in John's work, that was a finding. A second comment I would make, having spent a long time in-house and having a lot of people ask me at programs, what do you think about these filing fees? Aren't you really ticked off about these filing fees? Look, the filing fees have been substantially increased over my career. But are they a really significant tax on mergers? I don't think necessarily in most cases. I mean, they're not insignificant, but when you look at what companies spend on bankers and lawyers and economists, not that substantial. Here's my policy concern is tying agency budgets to filing fees, because then you have the entity with a stake in, to some degree, conduct that it can't directly affect, but generally, I think as a matter of public policy, we want to sever agency funding from anything the agencies could influence. So I worry about the trend toward bigger and bigger fees being used as the basis to fund more antitrust. If you want more antitrust, fund it out of the general funds. Do what you want on fees, but tying the two together is something of a concern, I think. Anybody else want to jump in on that? Okay, that was my one direct intervention. Hey, with that, I get to have the last word. Thanks to our panelists for coming and for a great discussion. And to all of you for coming today. Thank you.